There. There. All right. And now we are going to share our screen with our text. Hopefully, excuse me, that will avoid the problem as we had before. Such a strange system. Oh dear. Well, anyway, we are underway. And don't worry, for those of you who are looking at it on a small screen, I'm going to adjust this in a moment. But I wanted to show you where we were starting because it makes a difference. We are in the book of Devarim, of course, and in Parashat Vaetchanan, which we read this week, we get version 2 of the Aseret HaDibrot, of the Ten Commandments. Excuse me. And it is not a one-for-one repeat of the previous edition. And that's something we're going to have to talk about. And we are going to be relying entirely today, because sometimes consistency is helpful, on the commentary by Ramban. That's Nachmanides. So we're just going to look at some of the more obvious differences here, just to draw our attention to them visually. And then we will focus on the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy, and why they look different than the Ten Commandments in Exodus. That's Deuteronomy 5 and Exodus 20. If you would like to play with 2 copies of the Torah open, that certainly can make life easier. As you can see, Safaria does that very nicely so that we can compare them going through. So let's just go through and notice a few different things that are happening here. So we're going to start off in Deuteronomy as our primary text, and then I'll make references over to the Exodus version where necessary. And as you can see, commandment number 1, I am Adonai your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of a house of serfs, out of the house of bondage, out of the house of slavery. Many different translations for Avadim. That is identical between the 2 versions. And then in verse number 7 in Deuteronomy, you are not to have any other gods besides me, or beside my presence, Al Panai. You are not to make yourself a carved image of any form that is in heaven above, that is on earth below, that is in the waters beneath the earth. And as we can see, we are still working identically in Exodus 20. Let's roll these down. You are not to bow down to them, nor you are not to serve them. For I, Adonai, your God, am a zealous God. Zealous is probably the best English translation for the passion that Kana is trying to convey. Calling to account iniquity of the fathers upon the sons of the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing loyalty to thousands of those that love me, meaning thousands of generations, of those that keep my commandments. And again, so far, we are working in parallel between the 2. Moving on to our next commandment, number 3. You are not to take up the name of Adonai your God for emptiness, for Adonai will not clear him that takes up his name for emptiness. Again, we are in parallel here with this prohibition on using God's name in vain. Important word, the shav that we get used here. We're going to focus on that a little bit later. Emptiness or vanity were synonymous in the ancient world. When we talk about people being vain, it's not originally supposed to be just they like the way they look. It means they like something that is of no value or consequence, and appearances are essentially vain. That is to say, appearances may have a practical impact in the world, but they shouldn't, and thus it is considered to be vain. But here the 2 texts are in agreement. And now we get to our first and most famous differentiation, which is beginning the mitzvah of Shabbat. Keep the Sabbath day by hallowing it, as Adonai your God has commanded you. But you'll notice that in chapter 20 of Exodus, the first version of the 10 Commandments, we have be mindful of the Sabbath day and to hallow it. And you'll notice 2 major things. First, the first word, shamor v'zachor. Right? Shamor is the word we have here, which is being translated as keep, watch, guard. But Zachor in the Exodus chapter is giving us be mindful, to remember. But although that gets a great deal of attention, and our commentary will focus on that, we also have to notice that the end of the verse is also different. The end of verse 12, we have that as Adonai has commanded you. That is not mentioned here. So why do we have that I commanded you here, but not in the original version in Exodus 20? Additionally, why do I have that I commanded you for the mitzvah of Shabbat, but not for any of the other mitzvot that are being mentioned? Well, not for any of the other, but not for all of the other. That's a more accurate way of putting it. So we have a significant discrepancy in both wording as well as in the additional clause that is being used in reference to it. Obviously, we're going to have to come back and spend a great deal of time with that. But continuing with the mitzvah for Shabbat, for 6 days you are to serve and to make all your work, to do the labor that is done on the days that are regular days. But the 7th day is Shabbat for Adonai your God. You are not to make any work, you and your son and your daughter and your servant and your maid and your ox and your donkey and any of the beasts and your sojourner who is in your gates, in order that your servant and your maid may rest as one like yourself. All right, a number of changes have happened here. And we have, of course, the specification of the ox and donkey as opposed to just a beast. We also have the in order to. It is always powerful when we get a statement of why something is happening to notice that the Torah does not always give us an explanation of why a mitzvah was given. So if it does, that's going to demand our attention. And Ramban has us covered, and we will come back to that in our discussion. Continuing, we can see that the further elaboration of why we are celebrating Shabbat is radically different between the two. You are to bear in mind that serf were you in the land of Egypt. You were slaves. But Adonai, your God, took you out from there with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm. Therefore, Adonai, your God, commands you to observe the day of the Sabbath. Whereas in Exodus 20, it is speaking specifically about the creation of the world, not about the Exodus. So why a completely different justification in Deuteronomy 5 from Exodus 20? After all, Exodus was immediately following the Exodus, for which the book is named. You might have thought it was foremost on their minds. As we'll see, Ramban will advance some explanations for why we are saying what we are saying and what we can take it to mean. And then we get into the much shorter remainder of our commandments. Shorter not in importance, of course, but shorter just in the length in which they are explained. Honor your father and your mother, as Adonai, your God, has commanded you, in order that your days may be prolonged, and in order that you may go well with you on the land that Adonai, your God, is giving you. All right, so we can see that there are a couple of significant change here. In order that your days may be prolonged, yes, that's there, but there's an intervening line, as Adonai, your God, has commanded you. Again, this is something that was mentioned earlier, but not every commandment is getting this additional clause. Why is this getting that particular clause? And of course, we have the additional expansion of in order that it may go well with you on the land that your God has given you, as opposed to simply that your days may be prolonged on the land that Adonai, your God, is giving you. And then we come down to what should be the simplest section. No long sentences, no long explanations in either of them. And yet, you are not to murder, check. You are not to commit adultery, check. You are not to steal, check. You are not to testify against your neighbor as a lying witness. Or you are not to testify against your neighbor as a false witness. Well, as you may see, I have the same translation up, and I really wanted to use Fox this time because his translation theory was to try and use the same English anywhere that it was conceivably possible for the same Hebrew word. And this will draw our attention. Now, if you were reading from two different translations, you might be forgiven for thinking that these two translations are basically of the same Hebrew. What is the difference between a lying witness and a false witness? That surely must be the same. But if you look at the Hebrew, in the Deuteronomy text, we have ed shav, that's that word for vanity or emptiness. And in Exodus 20, we have ed shaker, which is more classically the word for a mistruth, a falsehood. So why the change in our Deuteronomy text, and what is it trying to draw our attention to? Again, that is something that Ramban will focus on. And then let's bring ourselves to our final commandment. And you are not to desire or covet, in some translations, the wife of your neighbor. You are not to crave the house of your neighbor, his field or his servant, his maid, his ox or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. And again, very, very similar, but in that second phrase, crave, well, that is a different word than desire. Tahmod is a different phrase. Tahmod is the classic word translated as covet, whereas kitaveh is a much more longing with an appetite, hence the phrase crave that Fox is using here. And of course, we also see that the order of things are a little bit different, and that we start off in our Deuteronomy text with the wife of your neighbor, and then go to the house. But when we are in the Exodus text, we start off with the house, and then we move to the wife. So some subtle differences there, and ones that demand some explanation. I'm just going to close. Actually, you know what? I'll leave these open, and I apologize again for people who have a smaller screen. Do the best you can, or open up an actual book, and then you'll be able to read it more clearly. Because if we want to refer back to this, we'll need both of them open, I'm sure. Now, what do we do with the fact that Deuteronomy 5 has differences from Exodus 20? Did Moses really not remember exactly what God said from 40 years earlier at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai? Is Moses deliberately changing the text between what was given at Exodus 20 and then what was given at Deuteronomy 5? Is Moses expanding upon it? Is he explaining it in some way? Or is this somehow really a difference without a distinction, meaning that, or a distinction without a difference, that yes, the wording may be slightly different in both of these cases, but that doesn't mean that we should take them as trying to teach us something fundamentally different. Well, we're going to look at one set of answers, and by set, I mean from one commentator. It is very much in your best interest to go and to read all the other commentators that handle these differences in their own way. But I wanted to present one sort of singular approach for how to reconcile these differences. Doesn't mean that Ramban is better than the others. It doesn't mean that he is more correct than others. It does have the advantage that he will occasionally refer to the others, which is a little bit more efficient as far as the time that we get to spend together. But he is not the beginning and end of Torah commentary. He is one voice among many. But hopefully you will find his insights inspiring and elucidating. And if you find them perhaps not completely satisfying, by no means should you be upset. Continue to search other commentaries. There are people who disagree with him, both before and after him, and you'll find out that he disagrees with many of them. That is perfectly fine in Jewish study and built into how we wrestle with the complicated task of transforming God's revelation into our understanding, into our actual lives. It's not as simple as just reading a book. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at how he wants to start us off on this journey of understanding this discrepancy. So now he begins. He, of course, is referring to Moses, the review of the Torah. He told them the 10 commandments, not changing and not explaining anything in I am the eternal, commandment number 1, you shall have no other gods before me, number 2, for they heard them from the mouth of the Almighty. So as we have discussed in previous years' discussions on Exodus or Deuteronomy, There is a great deal of debate of exactly how much the nation as a whole heard explicitly from the mouth of God. Some who say that it was only the first Aleph of Anochi, I. Some say that it was all the way through the first two commandments, which Ramban is agreeing with here. And some say, of course, that it was the entirety of the Ten Commandments. We're not going to open that debate right now, but that's what he's referring to. So he's explaining that there's no discrepancy in commandments 1 and 2 because everybody heard them. So there was no reason for Moshe to explain them differently than they were originally given. So too in the third commandment, where we talk about taking God's name in vain. Then he, Moses, began to exposit to them. All right, so notice that one of the techniques for explaining this discrepancy that Ramban is going to rely on is the idea that Moses is explaining to them the commandments, that mere repetition would have been insufficient to convey everything that Moses wanted them to understand. And this is a fundamental principle in all of Jewish teaching, that merely getting somebody to be able to parrot a text doesn't mean that they understand the text, and that when you restate it, you will need to explain it in a slightly different way. And Ramban is hinting here that Moshe is doing that within the Torah itself, that just as the Torah will need a verbal explanation, a rehashing to make sure that everybody understands all the details that the Torah is trying to convey in its very concise language, so too, generations later, we'll need to do that over and over again. This is where the idea of the oral Torah is founded. It is where anybody who has ever taught anything to anyone knows you must do. You can't simply read a driving book to a person and expect them to drive a car. You need to have a proper driver explain to them what those words actually mean in practice, and then make sure that they have gotten it by sitting next to them and holding on tight. So hold on tight. Here comes the explanation of the commandment regarding Shabbat, saying, observe instead of remember. That was our first major discrepancy. This being in line with the plain meaning of Scripture. All right, so very subtle, but what he has said is that in the original text, where it said Zachor, remember, that might not have been 100% clear to everybody listening, that when we say remember Shabbat, what we actually mean is to observe Shabbat, to keep Shabbat, to guard Shabbat, to essentially fulfill the mitzvot of Shabbat. And so by putting the word observe in, what Moshe is doing is using a synonym that will help us understand the original text and then actually fulfill Shabbat in a way that we might not have done if we had been relying only on our own conception of what the word remember meant in the first text. So this, says Ramban, is the Peshat. He just changed the word in order to actually explain the word. And by repeating himself with that slight variation, the original text, Zachor, remember, becomes much clearer in its implications for the people that are listening. All right, so that is a Peshat, a plain meaning, a surface level understanding, and we could stop there. But wait, there's more. Ramban, like the rest of our sages, is not content to simply say, oh, that's probably what it means. There's nothing else to learn here. He wants to dig a little deeper. And in the opinion of our rabbis, meaning going towards Midrash, remember and observe both were spoken in one utterance. Famously, this has been encapsulated in the first stanza of Lachadodi, Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad. These two words are spoken with one speaking, which of course is kind of confusing. He explained this to them here, meaning Moshe is explaining that these two words both came out simultaneously, and he's doing it here because they all know remember, meaning that was the word that stuck in their mind most from that original experience, and he is thus informing them that observe was said with it. So both words came out simultaneously. Observe is not merely an interpretation translation of the word remember. They are co-first words of this commandment, but most people only remembered, remember. They only had Zachor stuck, and Moshe is reminding them that along with remember went the word observe. And so it is by way of the truth, which is the code that Ramban will use for his version of Kabbalah, that they were both spoken in one utterance, seeing that the voice of God was both in remembering and observing. For the Torah is an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and sure. And he, Moses, heard from the attribute of remember, while they, the people, heard from that of observe. All right. I don't think we're going to be able to unpack all of the Kabbalistic implications that Ramban is trying to give us here. But by this third level, what he is saying is that indeed both words were spoken in one utterance, but they permeated, they penetrated the listeners differently. And Moses is now trying to fill in for the nation who were only able to perceive part of it, what the other part was. That is, he's giving that additional layer and recognizing that they came from the same God, but in different ways, and thus were experienced differently by the people. So Moses is trying to fill that in for them on this other level. All right, so 3 different ways to explain the variation of one word. Don't worry, we're not going to go through all one word changes quite that much in detail, or else we would be here till tonight. He explained, with reference to the commandment that we are to observe Shabbat, to keep it holy as the eternal your God commanded you. Why is it that phrase, as the God commanded you? Remember, that was the change at the end of that line. Before the giving of the Torah, at Marah. For there it is said, and he made for them a statute and an ordinance. So in the earlier stage of the book of Exodus, prior to reaching Mount Sinai, we had already been given some Shabbat instructions, especially about the issue of manna. So then, yes, God is reminding us of the commandment he already gave about Shabbat and elaborating in more detail here. So that's why it has that tail end, as God commanded you. This is the language of Rashi. That's what Rashi explained as why this was appended to the end of that verse. But, and Ramban is going to argue, if it is so, the commandment to honor father and mother was also given at Marah, or in the commandment to honor parents too, it is stated as the eternal your God commanded you. Remember, we pointed that out, that it gets mentioned only for these two, which if we're going to use Rashi's explanation for Shabbat, that it was already mentioned earlier at the time of the manna, then we would have to also assume that the honoring of parents must have been mentioned earlier, but we find no actual mention of that, because not only is it not written in the Torah explicitly, but even according to Rashi, Rashi mentioned there, meaning the listing of the additional things that were done earlier, only Shabbat, the red heifer, and the laws of justice. Well, that was all that was actually given according to Rashi. So how can Rashi say that this, as God commanded you, was appended here because of that reason, without taking into consideration that the as God commanded you was also stated with regards to honoring parents, which Rashi has already explicitly mentioned wasn't done during that time. So what Ramban is ultimately saying is Rashi's explanation doesn't stand up to its own logical consistency and scrutiny. And yes, that is okay. I know that many people use the catchphrase, Rashi kulo emes, Rashi is completely true, but that is not something that is meant as a catechism or an obligation. It means that Rashi is a great place to start, but he is not the only word on how the Torah should be interpreted. He made choices and decisions while drawing heavily from our tradition, but that doesn't mean that he closes the door on anything, or that we have to accept that every commentary he made was precisely accurate and true. Perhaps he misunderstood something. And Ramban is saying here, he thinks Rashi is not being consistent with himself, so we need a different explanation. And he is going to offer his. It appears to me, by the way of the truth, meaning Kabbalah, concerning this matter as well as the whole of Deuteronomy, that Moses was speaking as if from the mouth of the Almighty. As he said, and it shall come to pass, if you shall hearken diligently unto my commandments, which I command you this day, to love the eternal your God, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, that I will give you rain for your land in its season. Taken from the second paragraph of the Shema that many people might know. Now, Moses is not the one who gives rain upon the earth, nor the one who gives grass in the fields. So even though Moses is saying this paragraph in first person, I command you, I will give rain, we have to recognize that Moses is not saying the first person pronoun for himself, but he is saying it because he is speaking as if from the mouth of God. Now, this again is one of those controversies of the book of Deuteronomy as a whole, of whether or not Moses composed it and God ratified it, or whether or not Moses was speaking with the full divine inspiration to begin with, or whether or not these were the words God gave to Moses and then Moses merely recited them. Much debate on that, which we don't have to go into. Now, rather, how do we understand this text? Rather, the communication of the Torah was given with remember, and that of Deuteronomy with observe. Therefore, Moses everywhere in Deuteronomy mentions the eternal your God, while in the Torah, he mentions only the proper name of God, except in the Ten Commandments, as it is said, and God spoke. Understand this. Understanding this may be hard, but let me give it a shot. So Moses is speaking here with divine inspiration. That's a position that Ramban is endorsing. But he is endorsing it with the caveat that that divine inspiration is coming in different flavors, if you will, that there is a different emphasis in different elements. And we can know that by looking at the language that is used in the different portions of the Torah. Now, modern biblical critics have used that language difference to say that that means different authors wrote it. That is not our traditional understanding, but instead to say that it was being transmitted in a different aspect. The light of God, if you will, was being refracted through a different lens as it came to Moses, and we can see that in, for example, the names of God. In Deuteronomy, we are constantly using the word Adonai and Elohim together, whereas in most of the rest of the Torah, we use the name Adonai, usually without that additional phrase, except in the Ten Commandments, where we do get the additional inclusion of Elohim, of your God, or Elohecha. So what Ramban is trying to say is that, yes, there is a discrepancy here, but it is a discrepancy born out of a different aspect of God's transmission, and that is why we are seeing these small variations. It's almost as though you have the same beam of light, and you put a prism up in front of it, and then you put a different prism up in front of it. These variations in how the colors are spread out will be very, very similar, but not identical due to the small differences of the prism itself. That's about as deep as we can get for the confines of our discussion. We haven't even finished page 1, and we're already halfway through our time. Okay, so let's move on to our next discrepancy with regards to Shabbat. And in our next discrepancy with regards to Shabbat, we see that two animals specifically are being named, the ox and the ass. And why is that so? Ramban, again, he added here, stating, nor your ox, nor your ass, to explain that he prohibits working the earth, even though it involves the livelihood of man. So this is one of those, if it weren't there, you might have thought. And Ramban is arguing that Moshe is specifically trying to draw our attention to an implicit teaching from the original text in chapter 20 of Exodus, which is that we don't do any work at all, but by specifying these animals in particular, which were essential to the agricultural life of the world, which was the life of everyone, and livelihood here doesn't mean just getting your salary. Remember, livelihood for most of human history has meant literally getting the food from the ground you would need to stay alive. So by explicating this in more detail, not your ox, not your ass, nor anything, you are being told, take out of your mind that God would still let you work the animals that were needed for your food. You might have thought God just meant don't work animals that are unnecessary for putting food on your table, but food on my table, surely God would permit. No, says Moses, by specifying the ox and the ass in Deuteronomy. That is not what it means. It means no animal at all. Anything involved with your livelihood, with getting that food out of the ground. Of course, there's much more detail about the Shabbat prohibitions. That is all prohibited on Shabbat. That without these two words, we might have missed this. Again, this is Ramban taking the Moses changed things not to change things, but he changed things to make sure we didn't miss things that were meant in the first version, but which we might have missed because, well, we're not Moses. Continuing with the other explanation at the end of our verse there, where Moses is talking about remembering being a servant in the land of Israel, land of Egypt, excuse me. He stated here that your manservant and your maidservant may rest as well as you, and you shall remember that you were a servant in the land of Egypt, in order to explain that he commanded the resting of the servant as well as yourself, because since you were a servant and God gave you rest, so you too are to give rest to your servant. Thus, when your manservant and your maidservant will rest as well as you, you will remember that you were a servant. So he's trying to lay out, dissect the logic here. And again, he is explaining what should have been understood in the first text, but he thinks that Moses doesn't think that the nation would have gotten it without this further elaboration, clarification, that when we are told to allow our manservant or maidservant to rest alongside of us, that this should be something which jogs the memory of us being a servant, that it is a practical mnemonic, if you will. When we tell them, stop working, it's Shabbat now, right? Go home, rest, just take the day off, whichever way you want to phrase it, that when we say that to our servants, we are immediately reminded that we were once slaves in the land of Egypt, and that God gave us our rest, gave us our freedom, and thus we are more connected to our understanding of God. Now, that is a little different than some of the other ways to understand this. And we're going to get into this in more detail in the next paragraph, but I want to prepare you, because it might not seem clear at first what Ramban is arguing about. So let me just explain his position from this paragraph first, and I'll explain a generic alternative way, show the difference, and then we will look at him do that in more detail in the next paragraph. So in this paragraph, he is saying, when you make your servants rest, you are putting yourself into a state of mind to be more grateful and to be more aware of what God has done for you. So by letting them not work, you are creating a spiritual moment for yourself. Now, that's his general opinion. There are others who will interpret, and I'm going to give a generic version, but we'll see some examples in a little bit of variation. There are others who interpret this not as by letting them rest, you will have a different relationship with God by remembering Egypt, but instead, because you remember Egypt, you should understand why you need to let them rest. That is to say, grammatically, we would really flip these two parts of the verse, that because we remember being a servant in the land of Egypt, and we remember with gratitude what God did for us, we will therefore want to extend that same freedom to those that are working for us in our present day. Now, is there a huge difference there? Well, practically, no. In both cases, people who work for you are not working on Shabbat, and that's great. So we are following the mitzvot in either version. However, thematically and emotionally and potentially spiritually and how we relate to God, there is a substantial difference of whether or not I am told I should be motivated to release them from their work because of what happened to me, a sort of empathy motivation, or whether I am using my release for them as an actual trigger to force me to be more mindful of God, not necessarily of their feelings. Nothing wrong with having empathy for them and feeling for them, but, says Ramban, that doesn't seem to him to be the main purpose of this verse. Now, hopefully that wasn't too confusing, and it'll help you understand the next paragraph where Ramban goes into this in more detail as he disagrees with some of the great sages. Therefore, the eternal your God commanded you to keep Shabbat. Again, this unusual, or not unusual, but new ending that was not found as part of the explanation in chapter 20 of Exodus. The meaning is that he commanded you to give rest to the servants on Shabbat. So Ibn Ezra. So Ibn Ezra is being quoted here very briefly. So let me try and expand on it. And actually, this is probably one where it'll be good to point a little bit. Okay, so we see here in verse 15 from Deuteronomy that we are bearing in mind that we were serfs and that we are, and God took us out, and therefore we will observe. That this observe here, that this reminder of doing Shabbat is actually pointing back just to the end of that previous verse, verse 14, where it says that we don't work those that are servants for us on Shabbat. That our observance is narrowly focused on that particular question of allowing them to rest, that it is sort of one-to-one. You were a servant, therefore don't work the other servants. That's the observe, the keeping of Shabbat that's being discussed here. However, this is not correct, says Ramban. Far be it from me to argue with any of the giants, but Ramban is saying that Ibn Ezra is not correct. How does he know it's not correct? Well, we say in Kiddush, this is the prayer that we say while holding a cup of wine on every Friday night, for this day is the first of the hallowed gatherings recalling our going forth from Egypt, just as we say that it recalls the work of creation. So, no, it's not just about letting our servants rest on Shabbat. It's about recalling the Exodus in particular for us, and thus our gratitude to God, the same way that the Kiddush also talks about honoring Shabbat because of God's act of creation. So both of the two elements of the Kiddush, the don't forget creation and don't forget the Exodus, are both pointing at because God is great. God brought you out of Egypt. God created the world. Those are perfectly parallel in Ramban's mind, and trying to say that there are other reasons, more like the empathy reason that we discussed just a moment ago, is distorting what the actual import is of this phrase. Now he's going to bring in Moreh Nevuchim, also known as Guide for the Perplexed. This is Rambam, Maimonides' great philosophical work. The first statement in Kiddush expresses the honor and distinction of the day, just as he said, therefore the Eternal has blessed Shabbat and hallowed it. And hence he mentioned the reason for in 6 days. 6 days God created heaven and earth. Very good. But here, meaning in the section of Deuteronomy for the Ten Commandments, but here he warned us to observe Shabbat because of our having been slaves, working all day against our will and never having rest. And he commanded us now to abstain from work and rest in order that we remember the kindness of God towards us in bringing us forth from slavery to rest. Thus, Shabbat has, in general, two reasons: that we believe in the creation of the world, and that we remember further the great kindness that he did with us, that we are his servants, since he acquired us for himself as servants. All right, so, Moreh Nevuchim, why are we mentioning slavery? Because we are remembering the kindness that God did for us when he brought us out of Egypt. However, Ramban, a little bit more tactfully, says this is not all so clear to me, meaning like Ibn Ezra, but he's a little bit more deferential to Ramban. For when we are resting and not doing work on the seventh day, we are not provided with a remembrance of the exodus from Egypt, nor does anyone who sees us being idle from work have any knowledge of this. So Yes, we might quote remember, but is it actually create a remembrance when we stop work? When we stop work, it's very easy to just stop work without thinking about it and without focusing on, I am stopping work because of God taking me out of Egypt, and instead just think I'm stopping work because it's Shabbat. And even more so, if someone sees us sitting on the patio and just enjoying the day without working, are they immediately going to think of Egypt? Are they immediately going to think of us as having been slaves? It it doesn't feel like it is as declarative as Ramban would like. Rather, he will now present his view. Let me go ahead and get that full paragraph on the page. Yes, perfect. Rather, Shabbat is like all the other commandments, but it contains a reminder of the creation because of the fact that we rest on the day that God ceased from work and thereon and rested, right? Those are the two quotes talking about God resting. So as an element of, as a reminder of creation, that seems pretty obvious because don't work, rest. When I don't work, when I rest, I am one-to-one imitating God on the act of Shabbat. Therefore, that seems a pretty much slam dunk. And it is more fitting to say that because the Exodus from Egypt is evidence of the existence of eternal God, who caused everything to come into existence through his will and who has supreme power, as I've explained in the first commandment, therefore, he stated here, if there ever arise a doubt in your heart concerning Shabbat, that evidences the creation of the world by the will and power of God, you should remember what your eyes saw at the Exodus from Egypt, which is, to you, the evidence of his infinite power and the remembrance of his deeds. Thus, Shabbat is a remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt, and the Exodus is a remembrance of Shabbat. For on it they remember and say that it is God who makes new signs and wonders in everything and does with everything according to his will, since it is he who created everything at the beginning of creation. This then is the sense of the expression, therefore the eternal your God commanded you to keep Shabbat. So Ramban wants to go big picture. Right? It is not just you were slaves, now you're free, let other people not work, and then you'll remember that you were slaves and you'll be thankful to God. It is much more that when we think of Shabbat, we think of creation first and foremost. It was mentioned first in the Torah, in the Bible, and of course it is a necessary precondition for everything else to happen. Without creation, where would we be? But having established that, we might still sometimes fluctuate a little bit and not be as clear in our understanding, in our belief, in our faith of what creation means. And thus we will think about the more recent example by way of timeline, which is the Exodus from Egypt. And the Exodus from Egypt is not just evidence of God wanting to free us from the land of slavery, but it is evidence that God is the creator and that God has both the power and the will to shape the world in his according to his plan and design. So the Exodus from Egypt is not just in a case where we can learn empathy. It's not just a place where we can remember our own history. It is a place which demonstrates God's greatness, which will then reinforce and point us back towards our belief in God and creation, which for Ramban is really that fundamental principle of understanding God at the outset, that we need to get God in our mind locked as the force that brought all of existence into being. And the Exodus is one of those events that points towards that great belief. And that's why the Exodus is being mentioned here so extensively. It is not just about gaining sympathy for understanding the plight of those who work. Nothing wrong with having sympathy again. Ramban is absolutely in favor of having sympathy. And of course, he recognizes all of the other commandments that are there to protect the rights and needs of those who work in all levels of society. But Shabbat itself, he is arguing, is here as one of the great reminders of God as capital G God and God as the force behind all of creation. And that needs to dominate our thinking. So just to run back so you can see how that fits together with that earlier paragraph, right? When we are talking about this commandment to let other people rest, It is about reminding us of our liberation, not just so that we have sympathy for them, but more importantly for Ramban, so that we will then remember there is a God that did this, and that is the God that has the power of the universe, the power of all creation. And that reminds me that that is the God that we are pointed towards. So it is meant to elevate us higher and higher, not merely remember one historical event, even the historical event as amazing as the Exodus itself. Now, if you are participating in my Anyone Can Pray class, either online or in person, even better, you'll know that we've talked about that concept of kavanah, of intentionality. And so when we are saying the Kiddush, for example, Ramban would be arguing that while saying the Kiddush, we should be saying it mindful of this mental staircase of remembering the Exodus, to remember the creation, to remember God in all of God's greatness. Whereas others would argue that while we are saying the Kiddush, we should not only be thinking about God's greatness to creation, we should also be reminding ourselves of our personal gratitude for its own sake, and reminding ourselves of our obligation towards other people, as we, more than most, should recognize and understand that experience. Now, there is much room for discussion and arguing over which is the better kavanah, but I will tell you that if you are just beginning to understand that you need to have that kind of kavanah when engaged in tefillah, this Kiddush, this Friday night prayer, might be a great place to practice, to try and hold in your mind, why am I referring to these things? What is it meant to do for me spiritually, to transform in me, and try them on. And it's okay to try different kavanot at different times. It's okay to find yourself feeling drawn towards one intentionality more than another. Like I said, all of the versions that we are talking about here come from the great sages of our people over the last few thousand years. You can't go wrong. The only way you can go wrong is feeling like the recitation is just a set of words. That would be missing the mark. Still be doing it, you get credit, but you're not getting the benefit that you could be. All right, enough on that. More anytime you come to the prayer class, also on Wednesdays, but in the evening, and also on YouTube, of course. All right, so let's wrap it up because we've only got 12 minutes left. Sorry, 19 by the time, or sorry, 11 by the time I finish saying that word. So we're coming back now to our question of being a ed shav or an ed shaker, right? Are we being a vain witness, or are we being a lying or false witness? Well, Ramban explains the difference. He explained this, meaning Moshe changed the word from shaker, the lying word, to be shav, the empty word, to explain something to us, to prohibit that even meaningless testimony that will cause no harm at all to his neighbor in court, as, for example, if he testifies, so-and-so said he will give 100 dinars, money, to that person, but did not obligate himself to do so, that is still wrong. For the term shav signifies vain, worthless talk. So Moses was simply explaining what was already intended from back in Exodus 20, that when you are testifying in court, it's not just lying in a way that damages another person, saying he signed a contract to give 100 dinar, and that means he has to pay. But even if you say he agreed to give 100 but didn't actually sign the contract, then it may not stand up in court and then force that person to pay money that they never intended to do, but it is still wrong. It is still violating this commandment. So that additional switch from sheker to shav is trying to draw our attention that don't think you can get away with saying things that are null because they are silly, because they're not real, and they're not going to have any, quote, consequence legally. Even that absolutely prohibited when you are giving testimony. All right, and then we come down to our final commandment of coveting. He added an explanation in the commandment, neither shall you covet, in that he mentioned first his wife, in Exodus, the house is first, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Again, Moses is explaining that yes, the original version talked about the house first, but I'm going to mention your neighbor's wife first because the passion of our heart is incredibly powerful, and especially with respect to women more than anything else. That this is a common stumbling block for so many people to be both jealous or desirous of someone else's relationship, and that then needed to be brought to the top of the list in order to really hammer home to people the problem with doing so, and of course that it was a more likely pitfall, that it was something that a person might stumble on more than the other forms of coveting. He further explained that included in the term coveting is even mere desire. That's why we had, rather than tachmod both times, we talked about our appetite, our craving, as Fox translated it. Thus, what does this mean? If he desires to rob anything from his neighbor, but is unable to do so because his neighbor is stronger than he, or because in his locality there is fear of the government, he transgresses this commandment. So Ramban is arguing that, yes, your thoughts can be a violation of this if the only thing that is stopping you from acting upon them is your fear of the government or your neighbor's personal strength. But if you are indulging yourself in, I would take it if I could get away with it, if that was where your heart had settled, then you are indeed violating this commandment. We've talked about the concept of coveting in other classes. Just check out the back catalog. And you can see that it's a little bit more complicated than just having a flash of desire. It has to become a welcome thought that you embrace. But if you do, and you are only withholding yourself because of the physical barriers rather than, God telling you not to, then at that point you are believed to have transgressed this commandment. And he added here his field, which was noted at the very list of the things that you're not supposed to desire, about which the rabbis have interpreted the Mechilta, one of the early midrashes that covers the legal implication of the wording of the text. Now, what's the implication? Perhaps I may reason, just as the specific examples mentioned in the Ten Commandments and Exodus, for example, his ox, are movable property, meaning things that are, bought and sold and handed around, which may not be seized from customers in case of non-payment by the creditor. We know we don't take a millstone for a debt or a cloak and things like that. And since an ox is similar to that type of property, so also I can include here only movable property, which may not be resorted to for non-payment. So my own legal mind might have thought, if I only had the copy of the Ten Commandments from Exodus 20, that because all of the things listed there are more or less movable property, that I would be inclined to imagine that I'm perfectly able to covet my neighbor's field without feeling any guilt because, it's not movable property. However, when it says in Deuteronomy, his field, you must interpret the verse as follows. Just as the specific matters deals with things that one can buy and sell, so all things one can buy and sell. So in addition to your wife, for example, everything else that you can buy and sell, whether it be movable property or whether it be real property, cannot be coveted without violating this commandment. So, we often try to find ways around the law when it comes to our desires, and it seems like Moses knew us pretty well and made sure that he would explicate the details of the commandment from Exodus 20 in a way in Deuteronomy 5 that would prevent us from tricking ourselves into imagining something was permitted when in fact it is not. All right, we have finished with 5 minutes to spare. Quite surprised we got that all in. I was a little worried. As a reminder again, there is so much more to be said about the Ten Commandments, both versions. So please avail yourself of all of the amazing Jewish scholarship out there and keep studying. If you have questions, feel free to ask, and we will discuss this in more detail next time. Take care, everyone, and be well. Now I'm struggling with the system. Come on. What are you doing? Why are you doing this? Okay.